Ambassador Kethra stood alone in the center of the galactic assembly chamber, and her pale blue skin flickered with the soft bioluminescence of her people as fear and exhaustion dimmed her natural glow. The chamber stretched around her like a hollow moon, and thousands of seats rose in circular tiers toward a ceiling lost in shadow, and representatives from 100 species watched her with eyes that held no warmth and no hope. She was the last voice of the Valari, and in 3 days, her entire civilization would cease to exist. Honored representatives of the assembly. She began, and her voice carried through the translation systems that converted her words into 1,000 languages. I come before you not with demands or bargains, but with a simple truth, and that truth is that my people are dying. The holographic display behind her activated and showed the green and silver world of Valor, prime as it had been 6 months ago, and beautiful forests covered its surface, while crystal cities rose from valleys that had known peace for 10,000 years. Then, the image changed. Now the forests burned, and the cities lay in ruins and massive harvester. Ships hung in the orange sky like metal parasites, and they were stripping the planet of everything that made it alive. The Krell Dominion arrived without warning. Kethra continued, and they did not come to negotiate or to trade, and they came to harvest. And to them, we are not a civilization, but a resource, and our bodies fuel their engines, and our cities provide their raw materials, and our children are taken to serve in their war camps. She paused and looked across the assembly and searched for any sign of sympathy or outrage. The Vorex delegation sat in perfect stillness, and their insectoid faces revealed nothing, and they had built the largest neutral fleet in the galaxy, but they would not use it. The Molthari ambassador made notes on a datapad, and her expression held the same polite concern she might show for a minor trade dispute. The syndicate representatives were already leaving, and their seats emptying one by one, as if Kethra were discussing weather patterns rather than genocide. We have sent messages to every member of this assembly, Kethra said, and desperation crept into her voice despite her efforts to control it. And we have begged for military aid, and we have offered everything we have, and our arts and our science and our ancient knowledge, and none of it was enough. She had received 47 responses in total, and each one had expressed deep concern and sincere sympathy, and not a single one had offered help. The Vorex cited their non-intervention protocols, and they had maintained neutrality for 6,000 years, and they would not break it for one dying species. The Molthari explained that their defensive pact did not extend to the Valari sector, and they wished the situation were different, but treaties were treaties. The hegemony of caste had simply left, and their representative had asked why they should spend resources on a species too weak to defend itself. The Krell Dominion has consumed 43 species, Kethra said, and her voice grew quieter now. And each time they attack and the galaxy watches, and each time the assembly expresses concern, and each time another people vanishes from existence, and we tell ourselves that it could never happen. To us, she looked down at her hands, and they were trembling, and she clasped them together to hide her weakness. I am not here to shame you, she said finally, and I understand that politics is complicated, and that resources are limited, and that fear is a powerful force. And I am here only to make one final request. The assembly waited, and for a moment there was true silence in the great chamber. We do not ask for your armies, Kethra said, and we do not ask for your weapons, and we do not ask you to fight our battles, and we ask only for refuge. And we ask for a place where our children can grow without fear. And we ask for a corner of some forgotten moon where the Valari can survive. She spread her hands in a gesture of complete surrender. We have nothing left to offer, she admitted, and our wealth is gone, and our technology is primitive compared to yours, and we can only offer our gratitude, and our promise that we will never forget those who helped us. The silence stretched on, and Kethra felt hope dying in her chest like a candle in a storm. Then the Vorex Speaker rose and his chitinous body gleamed under the chamber lights. The Vorix Confederacy acknowledges the tragedy befalling the Volari people, he said, and his voice buzzed with false sympathy. And however, our protocols of non-intervention prevent us from offering material assistance. And we will observe a moment of reflection in honor of your culture. Kethra felt something break inside her, and a moment of reflection, and that was what 10,000 years of civilization was worth. Other speakers rose, and each one offered words, and none of them offered help, and the Multari promised to archive Volari cultural artifacts, and the Syndicate suggested that perhaps the Volari had failed to properly negotiate with the Crow, and the hegemony said nothing at all. After an hour of empty speeches, Kethra was ready to leave the chamber and accept that her people would die alone. Then she noticed one delegation that had remained silent throughout the session. They sat in the upper tiers and occupied cheap seats far from the center of power, and there were only 3 of them, and they wore simple uniforms without decoration or rank insignia. Humans, Kethra knew little about them, and humanity had only achieved interstellar travel 3 centuries ago, and they were considered primitive and emotional and prone to internal conflict, and no one in the assembly took them seriously. But one of them was looking at her, and his face held an expression she had not seen in the chamber, and it was not pity, and it was not concern, and it looked almost like anger. Not anger at her and anger at the assembly and anger at the situation and anger at the injustice of it all. After the session ended and Kethra returned to her small quarters, she composed one final message, and she sent it not to the great powers, but to the youngest species in the galaxy, to the people of Earth. She wrote, "We are dying, and we have nothing to offer, and we only ask for a place to exist. And if you cannot help, we understand, and we only ask that you remember us when we are gone." She sent the message and expected nothing as she began preparing the final evacuation orders for those few Volari who might escape on their own. 3 days later, a response arrived, and it was not from diplomats or politicians, and the header read, "United Earth Central Command." The message contained only 3 sentences. "Acknowledged in whole position and help is coming, and ETA 6 weeks. Kethra read the message 7 times, and she did not understand what it meant, and she did not know what kind of help was coming. But for the first time in months, she felt something she had forgotten, and it took her a moment to recognize what it was: hope. 6 weeks felt like 6 years. Kethra spent every day watching the skies and waiting for the Crow harvesters to complete their work, and waiting for the promised help that might never arrive. The Crow had slowed their assault, and not out of mercy, but because they were methodical, and they stripped each region completely before moving to the next, and they wanted nothing left behind. 3 billion Volari had lived on Vila Prime before the invasion, and now fewer than 800 million remained, and some had escaped on refugee ships, and some had hidden in underground shelters, and far too many had simply vanished into the harvester holes on the 42nd day. Kethra stood in the command center of the last functioning Volari settlement, and around her a handful of technicians monitored failing systems, and outside the shields flickered with each passing hour. "Ambassador," one of the technicians said, and his voice trembled, "we are detecting a large energy signature at the edge of the system." Kethra felt her heart stop, and she had 2 of them, and both went silent in the same moment. "Is it the Crow?" she asked. The technician studied his screens, and his bioluminescence flickered with confusion. "I do not know what it is," he admitted, "and the signature is unlike anything in our databases, and it is large, and it is getting larger." Kethra moved to the main display and watched as the sensor data updated and then updated again, and then again. The numbers made no sense. "That cannot be correct," she said, "and you must check your instruments. I have checked them 3 times. The technician replied, "And the readings are accurate, and there are 47 distinct signatures, and they are moving in formation, and they will arrive in Approximately 4 hours. 4 hours later, Kethra stood on the observation platform of the settlement and looked up at the sky, and what she saw changed everything she understood about the galaxy. The human fleet dropped out of faster than light. Travel like a fist punching through reality. 47 ships hung in orbit, and they were not elegant, and they were not beautiful, and they were brutal and functional, and covered in weapons and armor, and they looked like they had been built for one purpose, only war. The largest ship sat at the center of the formation, and it was so massive that it cast a shadow on the planet below, and Kethra later learned it was called the Use Prometheus, and it was a dreadnought, and it carried enough firepower to crack a moon in half. Ambassador Kethra. A voice came through the communication system, and it was deep and tired and human. This is General Marcus Webb of the United Earth 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, and we received your request, and we are here to help. Kethra could not speak, and she tried 3 times, and each time the words died in her throat. Ambassador? The voice asked. Are you receiving this transmission? Yes, she finally managed. And I am receiving you, and I simply do not understand, and we asked for refuge, and we asked for a place to hide, and we did not ask for this. There was a pause on the other end. And when General Webb spoke again, his voice held something like amusement. You asked for help, he said, and this is what help looks like. Within hours, the first shuttles began landing, and they carried not just soldiers but engineers and doctors, and construction equipment and supplies and more supplies and supplies for the supplies. Kethra met General Webb in person outside the settlement walls, and he was shorter than she expected, and his face was lined with scars, and his eyes were the color of stone, and they had seen things that she could not imagine. General, she said, and bowed in the Valari way. I do not know how to thank you, and I do not know why you came, and we have nothing to give you. Webb looked at her, and his expression was hard to read. You asked, he said simply, and someone should have come a long time ago, and we are here now, and that is what matters. Behind him, the engineers were already unloading equipment, and they moved with frantic energy, and they shouted at each other in languages Kethra did not understand, and they drank a black liquid from metal containers, and they never seemed to sleep. What are they doing? Kethra asked. Building defenses? Webb replied, and we have 19 days before the main Krell harvester fleet arrives, and in 19 days, we are going to turn this planet into a fortress. Kethra stared at him. You know about the fleet? She asked. We know everything. Webb said, and we have been watching the Krell for decades, and we have been preparing for this moment, and we just needed a reason to act. Why? Kethra asked, and the question had haunted her since she received the first transmission. Why? Would you risk your ships and your soldiers for a species you have never met, and why would you make enemies of the Krell? Dominion for people who cannot help you in return. General Webb was quiet for a long moment, and he looked up at the burning sky and then back at her. Because that is who we are, he said. And we are humans, and we do not abandon people who ask for help, and we do not watch genocide and call it politics, and we do not sacrifice the weak to protect ourselves. He paused, and something dark passed behind his eyes. And because we remember, he added, and we remember what it was like when we were weak, and we remember the times when no one helped us, and we swore that we would never let that happen to anyone else. The engineers worked through the night and through the next day, and through the night after that, and they built shield generators and weapons, platforms and underground bunkers, and they argued constantly, and they made mistakes and fixed them, and made new ones and fixed those too. A young engineer named Chun approached Kethra on the 3rd day, and her face was smeared with grease, and her eyes were red from lack of sleep. We need to know about your underground tunnel systems, Chun said. And we are building evacuation routes, and we need to connect them to your existing infrastructure. And can you show us the maps? You are building evacuation routes? Kethra asked. But I thought you were building defenses. Chan looked at her and smiled, and it was a tired smile but a genuine one. We are doing both, she said, because a good defense protects people and a great defense gives them a way out if everything goes wrong, and we always plan for things to go wrong. On the 10th day, the orbital defense platforms were complete, and they floated around Vela Prime like a ring of metal thorns, and each one carried weapons that could destroy a Krell cruiser in a single shot. On the 15th day, the ground shields were operational, and they covered the remaining Velari settlements in protective bubbles that shimmered with energy. On the 18th day, the long-range sensors detected the Krell fleet, and it was larger than anyone had expected. 200 ships were coming, and they filled the darkness of space like a swarm of metal. Locust General Webb stood in the command center and looked at the sensor data, and his face showed no fear and no surprise and only cold determination. All units, he said into the communication system. Battle stations and the enemy is here, and let us show them what humanity is made of. Kethra watched the humans prepare for war, and she realized that she had misunderstood something important. The humans had not come to give the Velari a place to hide. They had come to give them something far more valuable, a chance to survive. The Krell had never encountered resistance. For 300 years they had moved through the galaxy like a plague, and they had consumed species after species, and no one had ever truly fought back, and the prey scattered, and the prey hid, and the prey died, and that was the natural order of things. When the Krell fleet commander looked at his sensors and saw the human ships, he felt nothing but contempt. 47 vessels against 200, and the math was simple, and the outcome was certain. And this would be another easy harvest. He was wrong. The first human missiles struck the lead Krell cruisers before the Krell had even finished their approach formation, and the weapons were not elegant, and they were not sophisticated, and they were brutal kinetic projectiles that punched through shields and armor like needles through cloth. The Krell commander watched 3 of his ships die in the first 30 seconds, and confusion replaced his contempt. All ships engage, he ordered, and destroy the human fleet and leave none alive. The battle that followed would be remembered for centuries. The human ships fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen, and when their shields failed, they kept fighting, and when their weapons overheated, they ran to enemy vessels, and when escape was possible, they chose to stay and protect the planet behind them. Captain Sarah Okonkwo commanded the destroyer U.S. Relentless, and her ship was among the smallest in the fleet. And when a Krell battlecruiser targeted the main carrier, she did not hesitate, and she flew her ship directly into the path of the enemy fire. All hands brace for impact, she announced over the internal speakers, and her voice was calm and steady. And it has been an honor serving with you. The Krell barrage tore through her ship, and it should have been but Okonkwo was still alive, and her ship was still moving, and she turned what remained of the Relentless toward the enemy and fired every weapon she had left. The battlecruiser died, and so did Captain Okonkwo, and her crew became the first of many human martyrs that day on the surface of Velar Prime. The ground battle was even more brutal. Krell shock troops landed in massive drop pods, and they stood twice the height of humans, and their natural armor could stop most projectiles, and they had conquered 100 worlds with nothing but their claws and their hunger. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez led a squad of Marines, and they held a defensive line outside a refugee shelter, and 3,000 Velari civilians hid behind them, and most were children and elderly, and they had nowhere else to go. Hold the line, Rodriguez ordered her squad, and do not let them through, and these people are counting on us. The Krell came in waves, and each wave was larger than the last, and the Marines fought with rifles and grenades, and when those ran out, they fought with knives and fists and teeth. Private Chun died holding a breach in the wall, and Corporal Vasquez died pulling wounded Velari to safety, and Lieutenant Park died calling in an airstrike on his own position to stop a Krell advance. Rodriguez took 7 wounds during the battle, and she kept fighting, and when a Krull soldier broke through the line and charged toward a group of Velari children, she threw herself in front of them, and her body was a shield, and she absorbed the blow that would have killed them all. A young Velari named Shenri watched this happen, and he was 15 years old, and he had never seen violence before, and he had never understood why anyone would choose to suffer for strangers. He crawled to where Rodriguez lay bleeding, and her armor was destroyed, and her body was broken, and somehow she was still breathing. "Why did you do that?" he asked, and his voice was shaking. "And you do not know us, and those are not your children, and why would you die for them?" Rodriguez looked up at him, and her eyes were clouded with pain, but she managed to smile. "They are kids," she said, and blood dripped from her lips. "And what else was I going to do? And you protect kids, and that is just what you do." Medical teams found Rodriguez an hour later, and she survived. But barely, and she spent 3 months in recovery, and she never regretted her choice for a single moment. In orbit, the battle raged for 16 hours. The UES Prometheus took a direct hit that vaporized its entire port side, and 1,200 crew members died in an instant, and the ship should have been crippled and unable to fight. It was not Admiral Constantine ordered the damage sealed with emergency bulkheads, and he rerouted power from non-essential systems, and he turned his wounded dreadnought toward the enemy flagship, and he fired everything he had. "They think we are beaten," Constantine announced to his remaining crew, "and they think we will retreat, and they do not understand, and we do not retreat, and we do not surrender, and we do not abandon the people we came to protect." The Prometheus and the Krull flagship destroyed each other in a final exchange of fire, and Admiral Constantine died with his hand on the firing controls, and his last words were for his crew. "It was worth it," he said. When the battle ended, 28 human ships remained from the original 47, and the Krull fleet had been reduced to 60 vessels, and the survivors retreated to the edge of the system, and they did not try another assault. General Webb stood in the command center and surveyed the wreckage, and his face was gray with exhaustion and grief. "How many did we lose?" he asked. 19 ships. His aide replied. "And over 8,000 personnel, and the Prometheus is gone, and the Relentless is gone, and I know the names," Webb interrupted quietly. "And I will write every letter myself, and every family will know that their loved one died a hero." Kethra approached him, and her bioluminescence had changed, and it glowed brighter now and stronger, and it pulsed with colors she had not shown in months. "You won," she said, and wonder filled her voice. "We held," Webb corrected. "And there is a difference, and the Krull will be back, and they will bring more ships, and we need to be ready." "How can we ever repay you?" Kethra asked. "And how can we honor the humans who died for us, and what words exist for such sacrifice?" Webb looked at her, and his eyes held a sadness that seemed ancient. "Live," he said simply. "And that is how you honor them, and you live, and you remember, and you make sure their deaths meant something." 3 days later, intercepted Krell communications revealed the truth. The Harvester fleet had only been the vanguard, and the full Dominion Armada was mobilizing, and over 2,000 ships were preparing to assault. Velar Prime and the Krull warlord had declared this a matter of honor. They would not be denied their harvest. Webb read the intelligence report, and for the first time since the battle he smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile, and it was the smile of a predator who had been waiting for this moment. "Good," he said, "and now we can end this." He turned to his communications officer. "Get me a secure line to Earth Command," he ordered, "and tell them to activate Project Longbow, and tell them the target is confirmed." The officer went pale. "Sir," he said, "Project Longbow is a planet killer, and it has never been deployed, and the Assembly will—" "The Assembly watched while the Velari died," Webb interrupted. "And they can watch this too, and get me that line, and that is an order." In the depths of space, far from any inhabited system, 3 massive weapons platforms began to power up, and they had waited in silence for 50 years, and they had been built for a moment exactly like this one. The planet crackers were online. The holographic display showed 3 moons orbiting the Krull homeworld, and each moon was larger than most planets, and each one served a specific purpose in the Dominion's war machine. The first moon was a shipyard and 200 construction platforms covered its surface, and a new warship rolled off the assembly lines every 3 days. The second moon was a fuel depot, and vast refineries processed the raw materials that powered the Krull fleet, and without fuel, the ships were nothing but floating metal. The third moon was a training ground, and millions of Krull soldiers prepared for conquest, and they learned to kill, and they learned to harvest, and they learned that weakness was death. General Webb stood before the display, and around him gathered the senior officers of the expeditionary fleet, and behind them stood Ambassador Kethra and a handful of Valari advisors. Project Longbow, Webb began, was developed 60 years ago by Earth's Strategic Defense Initiative, and it was considered too dangerous for deployment, and it was filed away and forgotten, and until now. He pressed a button and the display changed, and now it showed 3 massive weapons platforms, and each one was the size of a small city, and each one bristled with technology that made no sense to anyone except the engineers who had built it. These are planet crackers, Webb continued, and they work by destabilizing a planet's core through precisely targeted gravitational pulses, and the result is total planetary collapse within 6 to 12 hours, and nothing survives. The room was silent, and even the humans looked uncomfortable, and this was not a weapon that belonged in civilized warfare. Kethra felt her blood run cold. "You intend to destroy the Krull homeworld?" she asked, and horror filled her voice. "And you would kill billions of beings and children and families and—" "No," Webb interrupted firmly. "And we are not monsters, and the Krull homeworld will not be touched, and the moons, however, are uninhabited. And they are military installations only, and they are legitimate targets." He pointed to each moon in turn. "Without the shipyards, they cannot build new vessels, and without the fuel depots, their existing fleet becomes useless within months, and without the training grounds, they cannot replace their soldiers, and in one strike, we can cripple the Dominion for a generation." One of his officers stepped forward, and his name was Colonel Harrison, and he commanded the fleet's engineering division. "The planet crackers require precise coordinates," Harrison explained, "and they need targeting data transmitted from within range of the target. And that range is approximately 50,000 kilometers, and that means someone has to get close enough to paint the target." "How close is close enough?" Kethra asked. "Inside Krull space," Harrison replied, "and past their defense perimeter, and within visual range of the moons, and it is essentially a suicide mission." The room fell silent again, and everyone understood what Harrison was saying, and someone would have to die for this plan to work. "I need volunteers," Webb said, "and I need people who understand that they will not be coming home, and I need the best pilots and the best engineers and the best soldiers we have." Before he could finish speaking, Commander Jin Yoshida stepped forward, and she was small and quiet, and she had led more successful missions than anyone else in the fleet. "I will go," she said simply. Behind her, other volunteers began to step forward, and within 5 minutes, 300 people had offered their lives for the mission. Kethra watched this happen, and she did not understand, and how could so many beings volunteer to die, and what made humans so willing to sacrifice themselves? "Why?" she asked aloud. "And why would you do this? And there must be another way." Yoshida turned to look at her, and the commander's eyes were calm and clear. "There is no other way," she said. "And if we do not stop the Krull here, they will keep coming, and they will destroy Vila Prime, and then they will find another target and another, and someone has to end it." She paused and glanced at the display showing the 3 moons. "Besides," she added, "my grandmother was Korean, and during her childhood, her country was occupied by invaders, and she told me stories about what that was like. And she told me that freedom has a price, and sometimes that price is blood. Webb nodded, and he looked at his volunteers, and pride and grief warred in his expression. "Prepare the mission," he ordered, "and you have 48 hours to say your goodbyes and to record your messages and make your peace with whatever gods you believe in." The volunteers filed out of the room, and each one carried the weight of what was coming, and none of them showed fear. After they left, the Galactic Assembly's response arrived, and it was exactly what Webb had expected. The Assembly condemns in the strongest terms any use of planetary weapons. The message read, "And humanity is warned, the deployment of such weapons will result in immediate sanctions and possible designation as a rogue species, and the Assembly demands the Project Longbow be deactivated immediately." Webb read the message aloud, and then he deleted it. "Send a response," he told his communications officer, "and keep it simple." The officer waited with his hands over the controls. "Tell them this," Webb said, and his voice was cold and hard. "And tell them that they had their chance to help, and they chose to watch. And now they can sit down and keep watching." The officer sent the message and said nothing, and no one in the room disagreed with the general's words. Later that night, Kethra found Webb alone in the observation deck, and he was staring out at the stars, and his face looked older than it had before. "General," she said softly, "may I speak with you?" He did not turn around. "You want to know if I'm certain about this," he said. "And you want to know if I have doubts, and you want to know if I lose sleep thinking about what we are going to do." "Yes," she admitted. Webb finally turned to face her, and his eyes were tired and haunted. "I doubt everything," he said, "and I question every decision I have ever made, and I wonder if there was a better way, and I will carry the weight of this choice for the rest of my life." He paused and looked back at the stars. "But I will carry that weight gladly," he continued, "because it means your people get to live, and it means the Krull cannot hurt anyone else, and it means that 300 volunteers will not have died for nothing." Kethra moved to stand beside him, and together they watched the distant lights. "The Volari have a saying," she said, "and it goes like this, and we believe that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more than fear." Webb nodded slowly. "We have a similar saying," he replied, "and it goes like this, and courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway." They stood in silence for a long moment, and outside the stars burned cold and eternal. "The volunteers leave tomorrow," Webb said finally, "and 300 of my people are going to fly into enemy space, knowing they will never come back, and I have to stand here and let them go. They chose this." Kethra reminded him. "I know," Webb said, "and that makes it harder somehow, and that makes it matter more." The next morning, Commander Yoshida boarded her ship, and 300 volunteers took their positions, and the small fleet of stealth vessels departed for Krell space. Yoshida looked back at Vila Prime one last time, and she thought about her grandmother's stories, and she thought about the Volari, children who would grow up free, and she thought about all the species the Krull would never harvest again. She activated her communication system and sent one final message to General Webb. "We understand the mission," she said, "and we accept the cost, and we will not fail, and tell the Volari that humans keep their promises." The stealth fleet vanished into the darkness of space, and behind them the planet crackers waited, and the countdown to the end of the Krull Dominion had begun. The journey to Krell space took 17 days, and every hour brought new dangers. Commander Yoshida's strike force moved through enemy territory like ghosts, and they hid in asteroid fields, and they disguised their ships as debris, and they avoided patrols through skill and luck and sheer determination. 300 volunteers had left Vila Prime, and by the time they reached the Krull system, only 47 remained. The others had been lost to ambushes and accidents and systems failures. And each death was a wound that Yoshida carried with her, and each name was carved into her memory. We are approaching the target zone, her navigator announced, and the moons are within visual range, and we have approximately 4 hours before the Krell defense grid detects us. Yoshida looked at her remaining crew, and these were the best soldiers and engineers and pilots that humanity had ever produced, and they knew they were not going home, and none of them hesitated. Begin targeting sequence, she ordered, and transmit coordinates to the longbow platforms, and let us finish this. The stealth vessels spread out in each one carried targeting equipment that would paint one section of the 3 moons, and together they would provide the precise data the planet crackers needed to fire. The first hour passed without incident, and targeting data flowed back to the distant weapons platforms and the coordinates, locked in one by one. Then the Krell found them. A patrol ship stumbled onto one of the stealth vessels by pure chance, and within minutes, the entire defense grid was alerted and warships began converging on Yoshida's position. We need more time, her targeting officer reported, and the sequence is only 60% complete, and if we leave now, the strike will fail. Yoshida made her decision without hesitation. All ships continue targeting, she announced over the fleet-wide channel. And we hold position, and we finish the mission, and no one retreats. The battle that followed was desperate and brutal and brief. Krell warships descended on the human vessels like predators on wounded prey, and one by one the stealth ships died. And each one kept transmitting targeting data until the final moment. And each crew chose duty over survival. Lieutenant Commander Park's ship was torn apart by Krell missiles, and his last act was to manually input the final coordinates for the second moon. Ensign Okafor flew her damaged vessel directly into a Krell destroyer to buy time for the targeting sequence to complete. Chief Engineer Yamamoto died with his hands on his console, and he was still transmitting when the end came. Yoshida watched her people die, and she felt each loss like a knife in her heart, and she kept the mission going, because that was what they had come to do. Targeting complete, her officer announced finally, and all coordinates are locked and the longbow platforms are ready to fire. Yoshida opened a channel to the distant weapons platforms. "This is Commander Yoshida," she said, and her voice was steady despite everything. "And targeting is confirmed, and you are clear to fire, and do not hesitate, and do not wait, and fire now." The response came back immediately. "Acknowledged, Commander, and longbow is firing, and may God have mercy on us all." Across 3 star systems, the planet crackers activated, and gravitational pulses beyond human comprehension streaked toward the Krell moons, and nothing in the galaxy could stop them. Yoshida watched the Krell homeworld on her sensors, and she waited. The first moon cracked like an egg, and fissures spread across its surface, and then it simply broke apart, and debris cascaded into the shipyards below, and 200 construction platforms vanished in an instant. The second moon followed, and the fuel refineries exploded in chains that lit up the system like artificial suns, and the shock waves destroyed everything within 1,000,000 kilometers. The third moon took longest to die, and it crumbled slowly, and training grounds and barracks and weapons depots all vanished into the void. The Krell Dominion watched their war machine die, and for the first time in 300 years they knew fear. Back at Velar, Prime General Webb received the confirmation signal, and he stood in the command center surrounded by his officers, and he felt no joy, only the weight of what had been done. The strike was successful, his communications officer reported, and all 3 moons are destroyed, and Krell military infrastructure is effectively eliminated. "And the strike team?" Webb asked. The officer was silent for a moment. 4 survivors detected, he reported. "And they are in an escape pod, and they are drifting in Krell space, and rescue is not possible." Webb closed his eyes, and 300 volunteers, and only 4 survivors, and this was the cost of victory. Far away, Commander Yoshida floated in a damaged escape pod with 3 of her crew, and they had barely made it out, and their oxygen was failing, and their power was fading, and rescue was impossible. "We did it," one of her crew members said, "and the mission was successful." Yoshida nodded, and she was too tired to speak. They drifted for 6 weeks, and they rationed their supplies, and they told stories, and they waited for the end. The end never came. Valari rescue ship found them, and Kethra had sent every vessel her people had left to search for survivors, and against all odds they found the escape pod drifting at the edge of explored space. Yoshida woke up in a hospital on Veloprine, and the room was filled with bioluminescent flowers, and the Valari had cultivated them specifically to honor the human heroes. A young Valari child stood beside her bed, and Yoshida recognized her somehow, and she was one of the children that Sergeant Rodriguez had protected during the ground battle. "Why did you come?" the child asked. "And you did not know us?" Yoshida thought about the question, and she thought about her grandmother's stories, and she thought about the 300 volunteers who had given everything. "Because someday," she said finally, "when Earth needs help, and maybe someone will remember that we came, and maybe they will come for us." The child considered this for a long moment, and her bioluminescence glowed bright and steady. "We will," she said solemnly, "and the Valari will come." 1 year later, Ambassador Kethra stood before the Galactic Assembly once more, and beside her stood General Webb, and behind them stood the survivors of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. The chamber was silent, and the elder races watched with shame and fear and uncertainty. "1 year ago I came before this assembly and begged for help," Kethra began, "and you offered words, and you offered sympathy, and you offered nothing that mattered." She paused and let the silence stretch. "One species answered our call," she continued, "and they came with ships and soldiers and engineers. And they came with weapons that could crack planets, and they came with courage that this galaxy has never seen." She gestured to the humans beside her. "They did not ask what we could offer in return," she said, "and they did not calculate the political cost, and they did not debate while my people died, and they simply came." General Webb stepped forward, and his face was hard, and his eyes were tired, and he carried the weight of everything that had happened. "We came because it was right," he said simply, "and we came because no one else would, and we came because we refused to live in a galaxy where genocide is acceptable." He looked around the chamber and met the eyes of representatives who had refused to help. "Remember this," he said, "and remember what happened when you chose to do nothing, and remember what happened when humanity chose to act." The Krell Dominion sent a representative to the assembly that day, and he was the new commander, and the old warlord had been overthrown by his own people after the disaster. "We seek terms," the Krell representative said, and humiliation filled his voice. "And we will withdraw from all conquered territories, and we will release all prisoners, and we will never harvest again." It was the end of 300 years of conquest, and it had taken one small species and 6 weeks of war to accomplish what the entire galaxy had failed to do. After the assembly session, Kethra found Yoshida in the memorial garden, and the commander was looking at the names carved into the stone, and 300 names for 300 heroes. They will never be forgotten, Kethra promised, and for as long as the Valari exist, we will tell the story of what humanity did for us. Yoshida nodded, and she reached out and touched one of the names, and it belonged to a young pilot who had died in the first hour of the strike mission. "That is all any of us wanted," she said, "and to know that it mattered, and to know that our sacrifice meant something." Kethra stood beside her, and together they honored the dead. Across the galaxy, species who had dismissed humanity as primitive and emotional began to reconsider. And they had watched the youngest civilization in the galaxy accomplish the impossible, and they had watched humans die for strangers, and they had watched courage triumph over calculation, and slowly they began to understand something. The humans had always known sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, and sometimes courage means standing alone against impossible odds, and sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the only one worth hearing. The Valari rebuilt their world, and they kept the philosophy of harmony that had guided them for 10,000 years, but they added something new. They learned that peace is precious, but peace must be protected, and they built defenses, and they trained soldiers, and they swore that they would never be helpless again, and they made one more promise.